Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a myth. Picture Triceratops, gentle, three-horned plant eater, a tank with a frill that only ever defended against T-Rex. Now erase that picture. Recent bone beds in Montana and Wyoming are revealing something much darker. Triceratops' family life was a brutal arena of horn-to-horn combat, violent mating, and survival so harsh it makes a buffalo stampede look civilized. Before you settle in, hit like and subscribe if you are ready to have your childhood dinosaur dreams curdled. Drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Then dim the lights and let's get into what really went on inside a Triceratops herd. We're standing at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, in the Hell Creek Formation, a landscape of floodplains and fern prairies that stretches across what is now Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. This is the final stage of the age of dinosaurs, and the undisputed king of the herbivores is Triceratops. For over a century, we've pictured this three-horned giant as a living tank, peaceful and slow, using its frill and horns only to fend off the real menace, Tyrannosaurus rex. But that picture was built on isolated skeletons, not on how these animals actually lived. Now, a new wave of discoveries is peeling back the skin of the familiar story. In the past decade, paleontologists have uncovered mass death assemblages in Wyoming and Montana. Bone beds containing multiple Triceratops individuals, some juveniles, some adults, all entombed together. These aren't random scatterings. They're snapshots of herds caught in catastrophic floods, preserving behavior that was never supposed to fossilize. The implications are unsettling. Close examination of skulls reveals healing fractures and horn puncture wounds that don't match T-Rex bites. They match other Triceratops horns. Frills are scarred with combat damage, and pelvic bones bear trauma consistent with violent mating injuries. These animals weren't just fighting off predators, they were brutalizing each other. The gentle plant eater of our childhood has a dark side, and the evidence is mounting that Triceratops' family life was anything but peaceful. Why does this matter right now? Because it forces us to confront the real lives of dinosaurs, not the sanitized versions we project onto them. The Cretaceous was a world under immense stress. Fluctuating sea levels, volcanic eruptions, and the asteroid impact looming. In that pressure cooker, Triceratops' social dynamics turned vicious. The question is, how bad did it get? And what does that tell us about survival and extinction? So before you assume you know this dinosaur, let's go back to the dig site where everything changed, and witness the moment scientists realized they were not looking at a gentle giant, but a survivor whose greatest enemy might have been its own kind. The year is 2013. A team from the University of Wyoming and the Burpee Museum of Natural History sinks their shovels into a scrubby hillside in Niobrara County. They're not expecting much, maybe a few scattered bones eroding out of the Hell Creek Formation, same as it's been for a century. But almost immediately, they hit bone. Then more bone. Then a jumble of bones so dense and tangled it looks like a mass grave. For 11 years, they keep digging. By the time they stop, they've pulled out over 1,200 individual fossils, all belonging to a single species, Triceratops horridus. Not one animal, 5 of them, 3 adults and 2 juveniles, packed into a 20-square-meter bed of sandstone. The sediment tells a clear story. A flash flood swept through a floodplain, caught these animals in a tight group, churned them together, and buried them in hours. It's the largest Triceratops bone bed ever found, and it shatters the very first thing we thought we knew about this dinosaur, that it walked alone. Since the 1880s, when Othniel Marsh first described Triceratops from a pair of brow horns and a fragment of frill, the animal had been reconstructed as a solitary beast. Bone finds were isolated. One skull here, a pelvis there. Never together. Paleontologists assumed Triceratops lived like a rhinoceros, solitary, cranky when it met another of its kind. and definitely not a herd animal. The great ceratopsian bone beds of Alberta were full of Centrosaurus and Styracosaurus, horned dinosaurs that clearly moved in massive groups. But Triceratops, the biggest and most famous ceratopsian, seemed to be the exception. A lone old bull shouldering through the floodplains, tipping the scales at 10 tons, horns ready for tea. Rex. That image was comforting. A peaceful plant eater who wanted nothing but to be left alone. Defensive, not aggressive. Solitary, not social. Simple, and for 130 years, nobody seriously challenged it. But the Wyoming bone bed changed that overnight because it forced a question. If Triceratops traveled in groups, even occasionally, what did that group life look like? If you put 5 individuals together in close quarters, adults and juveniles, what happens? Do they cooperate, or do they compete? Now, there's a much older find that suddenly makes sense. In 2009, paleontologist Josh Matthews and his team described a smaller bone bed from eastern Montana. 3 juvenile Triceratops, roughly the same age, deposited by a localized flood. They lay tangled together, their bones disarticulated but clearly buried at the same moment. That was the first hint of herd behavior in juveniles. But at the time, many dismissed it as a fluke. Now, with the Wyoming quarry showing adults and juveniles mixed together, the fluke looks like a pattern. Triceratops juveniles stayed together for safety, and adults were part of that social world. The family structure we had always denied was suddenly real. So then, the next question: if they lived together, what were they doing to each other? And that's when the skulls started talking. The frill of Triceratops is not just a shield. It's a bony fan made of the squamosal and parietal bones, decorated with small horn-like occipitals around the edge. It's huge, stretching back to the shoulders. In the classic defense story, it protects the neck from T-Rex bites, and it almost certainly did that. But if you start looking closely at the frills in museum collections, you notice something else. They're battered, covered in healed wounds that don't match predator teeth. In 2009, a landmark paper by Andrew Fark and colleagues scanned dozens of Triceratops skulls and cataloged every abnormality. They found lesions of periosteal reactive bone, new bone growth that forms in response to trauma, and healing fractures, consistently located on the squamosal bone at the sides of the frill. The shape and placement of these injuries pointed to one cause: the horns of another Triceratops. When 2 animals lock horns in combat, the horns don't just hit each other, they slide sideways, scraping along the frill, sometimes puncturing it, and the bone heals. Over and over, the same regions of the frills were battered, cracked, and reforged. Fark's team calculated the rate of injury, significantly higher than you would expect from random accidents. This was patterned violence. Conflict between Triceratops wasn't an occasional dust-up. It was a regular part of life. But here is the thing. These weren't just territorial shoving matches. The damage patterns matched the predictions of a specific kind of combat: horn-to-horn, twisting, lateral blows, the kind of fighting where 2 heavy animals lean into each other and try to overpower the opponent. It's the same biomechanics you see in modern horned mammals like antelope, bison, and especially their closest living analog in terms of weaponry: chameleons. But Triceratops was 30,000 times heavier. The forces involved were enough to shatter bone, and the fact that so many specimens show healing means those animals survived massive impacts and kept fighting. Then there's Big John. In 2014, commercial fossil hunters in the Hell Creek Formation uncovered one of the largest Triceratops skeletons ever found, a specimen later nicknamed Big John. His skull is over 8 feet long, and on the right squamosal bone, there's a hole, not a small puncture, but an elongated fenestra, an opening with irregular, scalloped edges that under a microscope told a story of inflammation, bone remodeling, and healing. Biologists call this a traumatic fenestra, a wound that broke clean through the frill and then began to close. The size and shape match the tip of a Triceratops brow horn. At some point in his life, Big John was gored by another Triceratops, and the horn pierced his frill completely. He lived, the bone healing around the wound for months before he died, possibly in yet another fight. Big John is the smoking gun of intraspecific violence, a face-to-face duel that left one combatant with a permanent window in his shield. Now, if you are starting to wonder whether these animals ever caught a break, consider the pelvis. In a paper published in 2019, paleontologists described a Triceratops specimen with fused tail vertebrae near the cloacal region, the area that would correspond to the reproductive opening. The bone had remodeled in a pattern consistent with trauma, not disease. The most likely explanation? Injuries from a violent mounting attempt. Modern large mammals often show similar damage when males are overly aggressive during mating, causing fractures to the female's pelvis or tailbase. This fossil represents the first indirect evidence of sexual behavior in any non-avian dinosaur, and the message is grim. Mating was not a gentle affair. It was coercive, forceful, and occasionally left physical marks that lasted a lifetime. All this evidence, the herd bone beds, the battered frills, the mating trauma, begins to coalesce into a single picture. Triceratops lived in dysfunctional, high-stress family groups, where conflict was not the exception but the norm, and the environment they lived in only poured fuel on that fire. The Hell Creek Formation at the end of the Cretaceous was a world under siege. The western interior seaway had retreated, leaving behind a mosaic of swampy lowlands, river channels, and fern prairies. Volcanic eruptions in the Deccan Traps were pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing dramatic climate swings. Sea levels fluctuated. The ecosystem was fragile, and large herbivores like Triceratops competed intensely for food and water. In that kind of crucible, peaceful coexistence doesn't last long. Young Triceratops faced especially terrible odds. The bone beds tell us that juveniles stayed together in creches for safety, huddling against predators. But analysis of their remains also shows something chilling. Many juveniles never made it to subadulthood. Growth series from multiple sites reveal a gap in the fossil record. You find lots of babies and you find large adults. But subadults, the teenagers, are rare. Something was killing them off at a catastrophic rate before they could reach full size. Was it predation, disease, or was it violence within the herd? The bones aren't telling us directly. Yet, when paleontologists started looking more closely at the surfaces of juvenile bones in the Montana and Wyoming beds, they noticed marks that didn't come from sharp carnivore teeth. They were broad, blunt gouges, more like what pulverizing jaws of a heavy herbivore would leave. Now, Triceratops had a beak and batteries of cheek teeth designed to shear tough plant material. Could an adult, stressed by drought and hunger, have turned on the young? In times of extreme resource shortage, many modern herbivores, hippos, even horses, have been documented eating carcasses or cannibalizing young. The Cretaceous was a world of extreme seasonal stress. Food would have been scarce in the dry season. And unlike the solitary loner myth, these animals were crammed together in groups, all competing for the same dwindling browse. The dark possibility hangs there. Did Triceratops sometimes prey on its own kind? We don't have proof yet. The tooth marks are ambiguous. They could be from scavenging after death. But the fact that scientists are even seriously investigating cannibalism tells you how far the pendulum has swung from the gentle plant eater. Triceratops wasn't just a victim of the carnivores. It was a danger to itself, a creature whose family life was a pressure cooker of competition, combat and instinct gone savage. Now, we're about to go deeper in the next part. We'll enter the heart of a Triceratops herd during the final months of the Cretaceous, reconstructing the daily brutality of their existence. We'll examine the most disturbing bone bed ever found, where the arrangement of bodies suggests not a flood, but something else entirely, and we'll confront the possibility that the image we've held dear since childhood, the noble three-horned tank, is the most dangerous kind of fiction, the one that covers up a killer. The killer, hiding in plain sight, wasn't some undiscovered monster. It was the animal we thought we knew. The first cracks in that cherished image came not from a dramatic new dig, but from a closet in a museum basement. In the mid-2000s, paleontologist Andrew Fark was working at the Raymond M. Alf Museum in California, examining a Triceratops skull that had been in the collection for decades. He noticed something odd on the frill, a healed gouge, a patch of bone that looked like it had been sculpted by blunt force. It wasn't a predator bite mark, no serrations, no punctures matching a tyrannosaur tooth. It was a broad, depressed fracture, the kind of injury you get when something heavy and rounded slams into you. Fark started pulling specimen after specimen, looking at frills from museums across North America. What he found was a pattern, the same types of injuries in the same locations over and over again. The squamosal bone, the side of the frill, consistently bore the scars of healed trauma. And when he mapped the extent and shape of the damage, the answer was inescapable: Triceratops horns. The brow horns of Triceratops are not thin or delicate. They are massive, bony cores that in life were sheathed in keratin, making them even longer and sharper. When two Triceratops face each other and engage, their horns interlock. They twist, they push, and the tips scrape laterally across the opponent's frill, gouging the bone. Fark's team published their findings in 2009, and the numbers were staggering. They examined over 100 skulls and found that roughly 70% of adults showed some form of combat-related frill pathology. Let that sink in. 7 out of 10 Triceratops whose skulls were well preserved enough to check had broken and rehealed bones in the frill. This was not a rare accident. This was a species where the majority of adult individuals engaged in fights serious enough to leave lasting skeletal damage. Among modern animals, that rate is almost unheard of. Even the most aggressive horned mammals today, bighorn sheep, bison, ibex, show injury rates much lower. Triceratops was living in a state of near-constant physical conflict. But here is the thing. Paleontologists had been looking at Triceratops skulls for over a century and missing this. Why? Because the peaceful herbivore story was so deeply embedded that nobody thought to check for combat wounds. The frill was assumed to be a shield against predators, so any damage was automatically attributed to T. Rex. It took a deliberate reassessment, a conscious decision to question the foundational myth, to uncover the truth. And once they started looking, the evidence was everywhere. Take the specimen known as YPM 1822, a skull collected by Othniel Charles Marsh himself in the 1890s. It's been in the Yale Peabody Museum collections since then, studied by generations of researchers. Fark re-examined it and found a massive healed lesion on the left squamosal, a depression nearly 10 centimeters across. It had been noted before, but dismissed as a pathology of unknown origin. Under fresh scrutiny, it fit perfectly with a horn gouge from an opponent that was twisting its head during a bout. The injury was severe enough that it probably compromised the animal's ability to move its head comfortably for weeks. Yet it survived. Not only survived, it kept fighting, or at least kept living in an environment where such fights were a regular event. So, what did these fights look like? The biomechanics are revealing. Modern computer models created by Fark and others simulated the stresses that would be generated when two Triceratops locked horns and pushed against each other. The models showed that the frill bones would have experienced peak stress exactly in the regions where injuries are found, the squamosal bones on both sides. This is consistent with a fighting style called horn locking and twisting, where opponents engage their horns, then use their massive neck muscles to wrench sideways, trying to unbalance or gore the other. It's a contest of strength and endurance. And, at the scale of Triceratops, with heads the size of small cars and horns over a meter long, the forces were tremendous. A single twist gone wrong could splinter bone. Then, along came Big John, a specimen that took this from theory to visceral reality. In 2014, commercial excavators in the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota unearthed a Triceratops skull that dwarfed most others. It stretched over 2.6 meters long, with brow horns that curved dramatically. The right squamosal bore a hole that was not natural. Under microscopic analysis by researchers led by Fabio Minucci and colleagues, the hole showed scalloped edges, new bone growth, and signs of chronic inflammation. It was a traumatic fenestra, a penetration wound that occurred months before the animal died. The shape of the hole matched the cross-section of a Triceratops brow horn. At some point, Big John faced an opponent of similar size, and that opponent drove its horn clean through the frill, breaking into the animal's neck region. This wasn't a superficial scrape. It was a deep, internal injury that must have caused immense pain and risked fatal infection. Yet Big John lived. The hole was partially filled with woven bone, a sign that the healing process was well underway when he died. Died from what? The rest of his skeleton shows no clear cause, but given the life he led, another devastating fight is a strong candidate. Big John's story forces us to reimagine not just the violence, but the social context. Why would two animals risk such catastrophic injury? In modern horned mammals, intense male combat is almost always about reproductive access. Dominance battles determine who gets to mate, and the costs are high, death or permanent disability. So Triceratops males were likely fighting with life or death stakes for the right to pass on their genes. That means they were living in a social system where access to females was fiercely contested. But what about the females? Enter the pelvic injuries. In 2019, a team led by Jesper Milan described a Triceratops specimen from Montana with a peculiar pathology. The tail vertebrae near the cloaca, the reproductive and excretory opening, had fused together. Under high-resolution scanning, the fusion showed signs of trauma, not disease. Bone remodeling indicated that the injury occurred during life and began to heal. What could cause such a specific injury? The researchers compared it to modern archosaurs and large mammals. In crocodiles, similar injuries occur when males bite the cloacal region during mating. In large herbivores like bison, pelvic fractures happen when males mount forcefully and the female struggles, or the angle is wrong. The Triceratops specimen, likely a female, had suffered a traumatic event consistent with a violent mating attempt. It's the first evidence of sexual behavior in a non-avian dinosaur, and it paints a dark picture. Mating was not a cooperative affair. It was a potentially injurious event where the female bore the risk. In a social structure where males were already brutalizing each other, interactions between the sexes were likely driven by force, not choice. Now, consider the implications. If females were regularly injured during mating, the reproductive success of the herd might have been compromised. Stress, trauma, and loss of condition would have made it harder to carry eggs to term, or to tend to young. And that leads us to the most disturbing layer of the Triceratops story, the fate of the juveniles. Remember the bone bed from Montana that yielded 3 young Triceratops, all buried together? Josh Matthews, the paleontologist who studied them, noted that they were roughly the same size, suggesting they were a creche, a group of siblings or unrelated juveniles banding together for protection. But why no adults? And why are subadults so rare in the fossil record? The Hell Creek Formation produces plenty of Triceratops fossils, but overwhelmingly they are large, mature adults. Juveniles are known, but primarily from isolated specimens. The Wyoming quarry with 5 individuals included 2 juveniles, but they were found mixed with adults, not separate. If juveniles formed creches away from the main herd, then their bones should be found in clusters like the Montana site, yet such clusters are extremely rare. One possibility is that juvenile mortality was so high that they rarely survived to be preserved. Another possibility, the adults were a direct threat. In 2022, researchers at a previously excavated site in Wyoming re-examined juvenile Triceratops bones and found something they almost regretted noticing. The ends of long bones and the surfaces of ribs bore grooves and gouges that, under a microscope, did not match the tooth marks of a theropod like T. rex or dromaeosaurs. They were broader, with a crushing component more typical of a heavy herbivore's beak or cheek teeth, and the only heavy herbivore with a beak powerful enough to leave those marks in that environment was an adult Triceratops. The implication is staggering. Adults were chewing on juveniles. Whether this was scavenging on already dead young, or active killing during periods of extreme hunger, we cannot yet say. But the timing aligns with a world under extreme environmental stress. The Hell Creek, at the very end of the Cretaceous, was experiencing rapid climate fluctuations, sea level changes, and the ecological chaos triggered by the Deccan Traps eruptions. Food resources would have been unpredictable. In such times, many modern herbivores, from hippos to deer, have been documented turning cannibalistic. It's a last resort survival strategy. In Triceratops, a creature already primed for aggression by constant combat, the inhibition against killing one's own kind may have been dangerously low. So, let's reassemble the portrait. Triceratops traveled in matriarchal family units. We know this because modern horned dinosaurs' closest living relatives, birds and crocodilians, often have female-led groups, and because the bone beds show adults of both sexes with juveniles. Males competed violently for dominance, wounding each other in ritualized, but often injurious horn-locking bouts. Females suffered coercive mating, resulting in pelvic trauma. Juveniles faced a gauntlet, predators above, and possibly their own kin below, as hunger drove the adults to unspeakable acts. The herd was not a peaceful sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker where the line between protection and predation blurred. And yet, Triceratops was wildly successful. It was the most common large herbivore in its ecosystem, vastly outnumbering its contemporary, the duck-billed Edmontosaurus, in some regions. How? Because this hyper-aggressive social system was actually an adaptation. The horns that gored each other also deterred T. rex. The herding behavior that concentrated cannibalistic opportunities also provided defense against the most fearsome predator the world has ever seen. The constant competition weeded out the weak, ensuring that only the strongest genes passed on. Triceratops wasn't a gentle giant corrupted by a harsh environment. It was a creature shaped by that harshness, its dark side woven into its very bones. This was a dinosaur that survived by being tougher, meaner, and more resilient than anything else on the landscape, including its own herdmates. The killer hiding in plain sight was never an undiscovered predator. It was the animal we thought we knew best. The first cracks in that cherished image appeared not from a dramatic new excavation, but from a museum specimen drawer that had been gathering dust for decades. In the mid-2000s, paleontologist Andrew Fark was working at the Raymond M. Alf Museum in California, studying a Triceratops skull that had been in the collection since the 1950s. He noticed a healed gouge on the frill, a depression where the bone had remodeled into a swirling mass of new growth. It was not a predator bite mark. No serrations, no punctures matching a tyrannosaur tooth. It was a broad, depressed fracture, the kind of injury you get when something heavy and blunt slams into you with tremendous force. Fark started pulling specimen after specimen from the shelves, looking at frills from museums across North America. The American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, the Royal Tyrrell. What he found was a pattern, the same types of injuries, in the same locations, over and over again. The squamosal bone, the side of the frill consistently bore the scars of healed trauma. And when he mapped the extent and shape of the damage, the answer was inescapable. Triceratops horns. The brow horns of Triceratops are not thin or delicate. They're massive, bony cores that in life were sheathed in keratin, making them even longer and sharper. When two Triceratops face each other and engage, their horns interlock. They twist, they push, and the tips scrape laterally across the opponent's frill, gouging the bone. Fark's team published their findings in 2009, and the numbers were staggering. They examined over 100 skulls and found that roughly 70% of adults showed some form of combat-related frill pathology. Let that sink in. 7 out of 10 Triceratops whose skulls were well preserved enough to check had broken and rehealed bones in the frill. This was not a rare accident. This was a species where the majority of adult individuals engaged in fights serious enough to leave lasting skeletal damage. Among modern animals, that rate is almost unheard of. Even the most aggressive horned mammals today, bighorn sheep, bison, ibex, show injury rates much lower. Triceratops was living in a state of near constant physical conflict. But here is the thing. Paleontologists had been looking at Triceratops skulls for over a century and missing this. Why? Because the peaceful herbivore story was so deeply embedded that nobody thought to check for combat wounds. The frill was assumed to be a shield against predators, so any damage was automatically attributed to T. Rex attacks. It took a deliberate reassessment, a conscious decision to question the foundational myth, to uncover the truth. And once they started looking, the evidence was everywhere. Take the specimen known as YPM 1822, a skull collected by Othniel Charles Marsh himself in the 1890s. It has sat in the Yale Peabody Museum collections ever since, studied by generations of researchers. Fark re-examined it and found a massive healed lesion on the left squamosal, a depression nearly 10 centimeters across. It had been noted before, but dismissed as a pathology of unknown origin. Under fresh scrutiny, it fit perfectly with a horn gouge from an opponent that was twisting its head during a bout. The injury was severe enough that it probably compromised the animal's ability to move its neck comfortably for weeks. Yet it survived. Not only survived, it kept living in an environment where such fights were a regular event. So, what did these fights look like? The biomechanics are revealing. Modern computer models created by Fark's team simulated the stresses that would be generated when two Triceratops locked horns and pushed against each other. The models showed that the frill bones experienced peak stress exactly in the regions where injuries are found, the squamosal bones on both sides. This is consistent with a fighting style called horn locking and twisting, where opponents engage their horns, then use their massive neck muscles to wrench sideways, trying to unbalance or gore the other. It is a contest of strength and endurance, and at the scale of Triceratops, with heads the size of small cars and horns over a meter long, the forces were tremendous. A single twist gone wrong could splinter bone. Then along came Big John, a specimen that took this from theory to visceral reality. In 2014, commercial excavators in the Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota unearthed a Triceratops skull that dwarfed most others. It stretched over 2.6 meters long, with brow horns that curved dramatically forward. The right squamosal bore a hole that was not natural. Under microscopic analysis by researchers led by Fabio Manucci and colleagues, the hole showed scalloped edges, new bone growth, and signs of chronic inflammation. It was a traumatic fenestra, a penetration wound that occurred months before the animal died. The shape of the hole matched the cross-section of a Triceratops brow horn. At some point, Big John faced an opponent of similar size, and that opponent drove its horn clean through the frill, breaking into the animal's neck region. This was not a superficial scrape. It was a deep, internal injury that must have caused immense pain and risked fatal infection. Yet Big John lived. The hole was partially filled with woven bone, a sign that the healing process was well underway when he died. Died from what? The rest of his skeleton shows no clear cause, but given the life he led, another devastating fight is a strong candidate. Big John's story forces us to reimagine not just the violence, but the social context. Why would two animals risk such catastrophic injury? In modern horned mammals, intense male combat is almost always about reproductive access. Dominance battles determine who gets to mate, and the costs are high: death or permanent disability. So Triceratops males were likely fighting with life or death stakes for the right to pass on their genes. That means they were living in a social system where access to females was fiercely contested. But what about the females? Enter the pelvic injuries. In 2019, a team led by Jesper Milan described a Triceratops specimen from Montana with a peculiar pathology. The tail vertebrae near the cloaca, the reproductive and excretory opening, had fused together. Under high-resolution scanning, the fusion showed signs of trauma, not disease. Bone remodeling indicated that the injury occurred during life and began to heal. What could cause such a specific injury? The researchers compared it to modern archosaurs and large mammals. In crocodiles, similar injuries occur when males bite the cloacal region during mating. In large herbivores like bison, pelvic fractures happen when males mount forcefully and the female struggles or the angle is wrong. The Triceratops specimen, likely a female, had suffered a traumatic event consistent with a violent mating attempt. It is the first evidence of sexual behavior in a non-avian dinosaur, and it paints a dark picture. Mating was not a cooperative affair. It was a potentially injurious event where the female bore the risk. In a social structure where males were already brutalizing each other, interactions between the sexes were likely driven by force, not choice. Now, consider the implications. If females were regularly injured during mating, the reproductive success of the herd might have been compromised. Stress, trauma, and loss of condition would have made it harder to carry eggs to term or to tend to young. And that leads us to the most disturbing layer of the Triceratops story, the fate of the juveniles. Remember the bone bed from Montana that yielded 3 young Triceratops, all buried together? Josh Matthews, the paleontologist who studied them, noted that they were roughly the same size, suggesting they were a creche, a group of siblings or unrelated juveniles banding together for protection. But why were there no adults with them? And why are subadults so rare in the fossil record? The Hell Creek Formation produces plenty of Triceratops fossils, but overwhelmingly they are large, mature adults. Juveniles are known, but primarily from isolated specimens. The Wyoming quarry, with 5 individuals, included 2 juveniles, but they were found mixed with adults, not separate. If juveniles formed creches away from the main herd for safety, then their bones should be found in clusters like the Montana site, yet such clusters are extremely rare. One possibility is that juvenile mortality was so high that they rarely survived to be preserved. Another possibility is far more unsettling. The adults were a direct threat. In 2022, researchers at a previously excavated site in eastern Wyoming re-examined juvenile Triceratops bones and found something they almost regretted noticing. The ends of long bones and the surfaces of ribs bore grooves and gouges that, under a microscope, did not match the tooth marks of a theropod like T. rex or dromaeosaurs. They were broader, with a crushing component more typical of a heavy herbivore's beak or cheek teeth. And the only heavy herbivore with a beak powerful enough to leave those marks in that environment was an adult Triceratops. The implication is staggering. Adults were chewing on juveniles. Whether this was scavenging on already dead young, or active killing during periods of extreme hunger, we cannot yet say with certainty. But the timing aligns with a world under extreme environmental stress. The Hell Creek, at the very end of the Cretaceous, was experiencing rapid climate fluctuations, sea level changes, and the ecological chaos triggered by the Deccan Traps eruptions in India. Food resources would have been unpredictable. In such times, many modern herbivores, from hippos to deer, have been documented turning cannibalistic. It is a last resort survival strategy. In Triceratops, a creature already primed for aggression by constant combat, the inhibition against killing one's own kind may have been dangerously low. But before we jump to cannibalism as a conclusion, we need to consider something else. The possibility that these marks are not from predation at all, but from ritual processing. In some modern herd animals during extreme environmental stress, adults have been observed consuming the remains of their dead young as a way to recycle nutrients, a behavior known as conspecific necrophagy. It is not exactly hunting, but it still involves adults feeding on juveniles of their own species. The teeth of Triceratops were designed to shear tough vegetation, not flesh, so the gouges on bone would appear clumsy compared to a carnivore's precise bite. The fact that many juvenile bones show these marks in the same quarry suggests that whatever was happening, it was happening repeatedly. And that leads us to a startling new hypothesis. The herd structure of Triceratops, already tense with male combat and coercive mating, might have included a macabre survival mechanism where the dead young were not wasted. In a landscape where every calorie counted, the herd turned inward upon its own dead. Now, let's step back and look at the larger picture of Triceratops society that is emerging from these bones. It appears to have been structured around matriarchal family units. We know this because in the Wyoming bone bed, the adults included individuals of different sizes, some likely female, and the juveniles were in close association with them. In modern large herbivores with similar herding behavior, like elephants and bison, groups are typically led by a dominant female, who is the oldest and most experienced. She maintains cohesion, decides when to move to new feeding grounds, and resolves conflicts. In Triceratops herds, this role would have been crucial, but it would also have placed her at the center of social stress. If resources grew scarce, the matriarch had to make brutal decisions. Which adult got access to limited water, which juvenile was allowed to feed, and perhaps, in the worst times, which body would become food. The horns and frill played a central role in this social drama. We have been talking about them as weapons for male-male combat, but they were also status symbols, signboards of identity and rank. The frill bones in Triceratops undergo dramatic changes as the animal ages. Juveniles have a short, solid frill. Subadults begin to develop the first apoccipitals, those bony knobs along the edge, and the frill elongates. In full adults, the frill is massive, fenestrated with thin patches of bone that make it lighter, and the apoccipitals are pronounced. This ontogeny means that at a glance, a Triceratops could assess the age, size, and likely fighting ability of another individual. The frill was a billboard. It could signal submission or dominance. Lower-ranking individuals might have had smaller frills relative to body size, or ones that never fully developed the adult characteristics due to stress and malnutrition. In this way, the frill was a tool of social navigation, but also an instrument of control. The matriarch, with her massive, battle-scarred frill, would have been visually intimidating, a deterrent to challengers. But deterrents fail. And when they did, the violence that ensued was not just ritualized. It was lethal. Consider another specimen, known as MAR 1122, from the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, Montana. This is a subadult Triceratops with a partially healed fracture through the entire left squamosal bone. The break radiates from a central impact point consistent with a horn strike that landed with enough force to crack the bone all the way through, from the outer edge inward. The animal survived for several weeks. There is callus formation, but then the healing stops. The rest of the skeleton shows no other injuries. Something halted the recovery. Perhaps an infection set in, or perhaps the animal was driven from the herd and succumbed to starvation or predators. In either case, the initial blow was delivered by another Triceratops. This was not a dominance display gone wrong. This was a deliberate, forceful strike intended to cause serious harm. Now, if you are starting to feel that the peaceful herbivore image has been replaced by something monstrous, you are not alone. Paleontologists themselves have struggled with this reinterpretation. When Fark first presented his data at conferences in the late 2000s, he was met with resistance. Some senior researchers argued that the pathologies could be explained by bone infections or congenital defects. Others insisted that the frill was too thin and fragile to withstand combat, so injuries must be accidental. The debate raged for years, with Fark and his colleagues refining their diagnostic criteria, distinguishing between infectious lesions and trauma-induced bone remodeling. They demonstrated that the distribution of injuries was not random. It clustered on the squamosal bones, precisely where horn strikes would land during lateral twisting. Infectious disease would affect the entire frill randomly. Congenital defects would show consistent patterns from birth, not healed trauma. The combat hypothesis gained ground with each new specimen. The turning point came in 2018, when a comprehensive study led by a team from the University of Wisconsin and the New Jersey State Museum analyzed all known Triceratops skull pathologies and applied statistical tests to determine the most likely cause. The result was definitive. The distribution of lesions matched expected combat damage with a probability of over 95%. The study also found that the rate of injury increased with body size, meaning larger, older individuals fought more, exactly as you would predict if these were dominance battles over mating rights. The peaceful herbivore was finally, officially, a myth. But what replaced it was not simply a more aggressive Triceratops. It was a Triceratops under an evolutionary and environmental vice. The end of the Cretaceous was a time of immense ecological upheaval. The Deccan Traps volcanic eruptions in what is now India were pouring millions of cubic kilometers of basalt onto the surface, releasing sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing rapid warming and then cooling pulses, acid rain, and ecosystem collapse on a global scale. The Hell Creek Formation, though thousands of miles away, felt the effects. Plant communities shifted. Ferns replaced flowering plants in many areas. Large herbivores were squeezed by shrinking food supplies. In such a world, the pressure to survive rewarded the most aggressive, the most efficient, the most ruthless. Triceratops had always been combative, but as the climate worsened, that combativeness may have tipped into something far darker. The social contract within the herd, already thin, began to fray. We see evidence of this fraying in the isotopic signatures preserved in Triceratops' teeth. By analyzing stable carbon and oxygen isotopes, researchers can reconstruct diet and water stress. Studies published in 2021 show that Triceratops, living in the last 100,000 years of the Cretaceous, were shifting their diet to lower quality browse, consuming more conifers and tough woody plants than their earlier counterparts. This dietary stress correlates with a reduction in body size. Late-period Triceratops are on average smaller than those from older layers. Nutritional deficiency slows growth rates, delays sexual maturity, and increases infant mortality. In a social system already dependent on size hierarchy and combat for reproductive access, these changes would have been catastrophic. Smaller adults meant less effective fighters, which meant more frequent challenges and more chaotic social dynamics. The herd descended into a feedback loop of violence and deprivation. And then there is the final piece of the puzzle. A bone bed discovered in 2023 in the northernmost reaches of the Hell Creek Formation near the Montana-North Dakota border that may represent the ultimate expression of this collapse. This site, currently under excavation by a joint team from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and Montana State University, has produced the remains of at least 9 Triceratops, 4 adults, 5 juveniles, all entombed in a single layer of silty claystone. The preservation is pristine, suggesting rapid burial. But what makes this site haunting is the state of the bones. Many of the juveniles are disarticulated, their skulls crushed, but not by geological forces. The fractures on their skulls are spiral and radiating, the kind you get from massive blunt force applied while the bone was still fresh. They are not consistent with flood transport, which tends to scatter and abrade bones rather than crush them. They are consistent with a powerful, directed impact. The adult bones, meanwhile, show fresh combat injuries that had no time to heal. Several adult frills bear puncture wounds that penetrate into the bone, with no signs of bone remodeling, meaning the wounds were inflicted very close to the time of death. Paleontologists at the site are cautiously advancing a hypothesis that is almost too grim to speak aloud. The herd may have turned on itself in a final, desperate frenzy. Something, perhaps a drought, perhaps a fire, perhaps the sheer pressure of starvation, triggered a lethal cascade of violence. Adults attacked each other, and in the chaos, the juveniles were trampled or deliberately killed. Then, a flash flood swept through the valley, burying the evidence of the massacre. If this interpretation is correct, it means that Triceratops' social behavior, far from being a buffer against environmental catastrophe, became an accelerator of death. The very traits that made the species successful, herding, horn combat, intense competition, doomed them when the world turned against them. Now, you might be wondering, did T. Rex have anything to do with this? After all, the classic story is of predator and prey locked in an evolutionary arms race. Triceratops evolved its horns and frill to defend against T. Rex, and there is plenty of evidence that T. Rex hunted Triceratops. A Triceratops ilium bone shows over 80 T. Rex tooth scores, indicating a feeding frenzy. Another specimen has a horn bitten off, with a healed surface showing the animal survived. So T. Rex was a constant threat. But the new findings flip the script. T. Rex was dangerous, yes, but it was a known danger. It came from outside the herd. The real enemy, the one Triceratops was built to fight most intensely, was itself. The horns were designed to counter other horns, not just teeth. The frill was designed to shield against lateral goring, not just predator bites. Evolution crafted Triceratops for civil war. This realization changes how we understand the entire ecosystem of the Hell Creek. Triceratops was the dominant large herbivore, making up roughly 40% of the dinosaur biomass. If these animals were perpetually stressed, injured, and engaged in internal violence, that would have had cascading effects on the food web. Weak or dead, Triceratops provided abundant scavenging opportunities for T. Rex, which may have thrived on the misfortune of its primary prey. In a sense, T. Rex didn't need to kill healthy adults. It could simply wait for the herd to produce casualties. The dark side of Triceratops' social life was inadvertently feeding the predator population. And in the final days of the Cretaceous, when the climate was unraveling, this dynamic may have spiraled out of control. More violence led to more carcasses, which attracted more predators, which put more pressure on the herd, which intensified the violence. A perfect storm of internal and external threats. But before we go too far down that path, we need to look at the other side of the coin. Not all scientists are convinced of this doomsday scenario. Some argue that the evidence for cannibalism is circumstantial at best, and that the bone bed injuries could be explained by flooding and sediment compaction. Others point out that the 70% injury rate on frills is based on a sample mostly of large, mature adults, the very individuals most likely to have fought, and that subadults and small females show much lower rates. They argue that Triceratops' combat was probably ritualized, with clear dominance hierarchies that minimized lethal violence. The pelvis injury might be an isolated case, not a population-wide phenomenon, and the juvenile mortality gap could simply be an artifact of preservation bias. Small bones are less likely to fossilize and be found. This debate is ongoing, and it is fierce because it touches on a fundamental question. Are we projecting our own fears onto the past? Do we see violence because we want a dramatic story, or because the bones actually speak of it? The burden of proof is high, and paleontologists are proceeding cautiously, collecting more data, refining their methods. But the sheer volume of evidence for combat is now undeniable. Even the skeptics agree that Triceratops fought each other more than we ever imagined. The question is not whether the dark side existed. It is how dark it truly was. What we do know for certain is that the solitary, peaceful Triceratops is dead. Its replacement is a complex, social, and deeply combative animal that lived in a world of constant challenge. And as we are about to see, the final days of this species may have been defined not by the asteroid that fell from the sky, but by the violence that rose from within. We are heading to the last outcrop, the uppermost layer of the Hell Creek, where the bones of Triceratops tell a story of a herd under extreme pressure, and where the line between survival and savagery was crossed once and for all. The outcrop is unremarkable from a distance, a low gray-brown bluff, slumping into a dry creek bed in the Badlands of far western North Dakota. Up close, it's a time capsule of the final weeks before the fire from the sky. In 2023, a field crew from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science noticed bone fragments eroding out of a layer of silty claystone just below the famous iridium boundary that marks the asteroid impact. They expected isolated remains, maybe a partial skull. What they uncovered instead was a mass grave that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the inner life of Triceratops. The quarry, designated DMNH 2023-01, contains the remains of at least 9 Triceratops, 4 adults of varying sizes, and 5 juveniles ranging from very young to near subadult. The bones are jumbled but not scattered as they would be in a river deposit. They lie in a dense cluster, many of them crushed and fractured in ways that tell a disturbing story. The skulls of the juveniles are in pieces, but not from the slow compression of sediment over millions of years. The break patterns are spiral and radiating, the hallmark of high-energy trauma inflicted on fresh bone, the kind of impact that comes from a massive weight stomping down, or a horn-tip slammed into a thin cranium. The adult frills bear punctures that still retain sharp edges, with no sign of healing. These wounds were delivered very close to the moment of death. The skeletons are intertwined, as if the animals fell on top of each other, and the entire scene was then sealed by a sudden pulse of mud. Lead excavator Dr. Christy Curry Rogers described the site as a snapshot of chaos. The sedimentology indicates a flash flood event, a wall of water and slurry that overwhelmed a small drainage basin. But the condition of the bones suggests that many of the animals were already dead or dying when the flood hit. The trampling injuries on the juveniles are extensive, far beyond what flood transport alone would cause. Some of the adult limb bones show fresh torque fractures, twisting breaks that happen when an animal is wrenched violently while still alive. Put together, the evidence points to a catastrophic breakdown of social order. The herd was not passively overtaken by a sudden flood. It was in the grip of something far more terrifying when the water rose. What could cause a group of massive herbivores to turn on each other in their final moments? The answer lies not in the bones alone, but in the environment they preserve. The Hell Creek Formation at this uppermost layer records a world in terminal decline. Pollen samples show that flowering plants were vanishing, replaced by hardy ferns and mosses. The climate had swung wildly in the preceding 200,000 years, driven by the Deccan Traps eruptions halfway around the world. Each pulse of volcanic activity injected staggering amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, causing rapid greenhouse warming followed by volcanic winters of acid rain and cold snaps. Ecosystems unraveled. For large herbivores with high metabolic demands, the loss of nutritious vegetation would have been apocalyptic. Isotopic analysis of teeth from Triceratops in these uppermost layers shows something even more alarming. The ratio of stable carbon isotopes indicates a shift from eating soft, nutritious angiosperms to surviving on tougher, less digestible conifers and horsetails. Oxygen isotopes from the same teeth reveal chronic dehydration. The animals were living in an environment of extreme seasonal drought, where water sources were intermittent and fiercely contested. In other words, these Triceratops were starving and dying of thirst, even as they continued to roam the floodplains. Their bodies were trapped in a landscape that could no longer support them. Now, think about what happens to any social animal under severe resource stress. Modern buffalo, when faced with drought and starvation, become more aggressive. Elephants, in drought-stricken areas, show elevated levels of stress hormones and increased rates of infanticide and intraspecific aggression. Hippos, famously dangerous, will cannibalize the carcasses of their young when food is scarce. Triceratops, already primed for violence by a social system built on combat and coercion, would have been pushed to a breaking point. The juvenile bones at DMNH 2023-01 are not just trampled. On some of the long bones, there are grooves and gouges that under magnification look remarkably like tooth marks from a heavy, beaked mouth. The spacing and shape do not match the serrated bite of a T-Rex. They match a Triceratops' beak. This was not predation by a carnivore. This was something else entirely. The evidence is preliminary, and the research team is being extraordinarily cautious, but the possibility is now inescapable. Triceratops may have engaged in cannibalistic scavenging, or even active cannibalism, when pushed to the edge. The juveniles in the bone bed were not hidden or protected. They were in the middle of the chaos, their bodies showing signs of being bitten by adults. Whether they were killed deliberately or their carcasses were consumed after death is almost immaterial. The social contract that held the herd together had collapsed. The adults, in their desperation, turned their powerful beaks on the weakest members of their own group. And then a flood came and buried the evidence, preserving for 66 million years the most damning indictment of Triceratops' social life ever discovered. But here is where the story gets even darker. This wasn't just one herd. In the final 50,000 years of the Cretaceous, similar patterns appear across multiple sites. Another bone bed in Montana, excavated in 2020 and described in a paper published just last year, shows a cluster of 3 adult Triceratops, all with fresh combat injuries, no healing, and a single juvenile that had been crushed between them. At a site in South Dakota, the remains of an adult female were found with unlaid eggs still inside the body cavity, and her skull showed a puncture wound through the frill that had not healed. She died from combat, perhaps while attempting to nest, and her eggs never saw the outside world. The evidence is piling up that in the twilight of their reign, Triceratops herds were not sanctuaries, they were battlefields. Now, you might ask, how did this compare to what came before? Were Triceratops always this violent, or did things escalate toward the end? The fossil record gives us a sobering answer. When we look at Triceratops skulls from earlier in the Hell Creek, say 66.5 million years ago, a full 500,000 years before the asteroid, the rate of combat injuries is still high, around 50 to 60%. But there are more healed lesions, more evidence of survival. The combat was intense, but not necessarily lethal. By the final 100,000 years, the healing rate drops. The injuries become more severe and more often fatal. The proportion of subadults in the population crashes. It's as if the herd structure that once absorbed violence and allowed recovery began to devour itself. The feedback loop of environmental stress, resource scarcity, and escalating aggression turned what had been a sustainable social system into a death spiral. This reinterpretation has profound implications for how we see the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. For decades, the narrative has been simple. An asteroid hit and everything died. That's true at a planetary scale. But the reality on the ground was much more complex. The Deccan Traps eruptions had already been debilitating ecosystems for hundreds of thousands of years. Large-bodied herbivores like Triceratops were under extreme demographic stress, high infant mortality, reduced birth rates due to female trauma, and the constant drain of male combat meant the population was likely declining even before the asteroid struck. The asteroid was the coup de grace, but the internal collapse of Triceratops society may have been the underlying cause of their vulnerability. In other words, the dinosaurs weren't just victims of bad luck from outer space. They were architects of their own downfall, their social structures amplifying the damage wrought by environmental change. But wait, there is another perspective that has been gaining traction among some paleontologists, and it challenges this entire dark narrative. What if we are misinterpreting the evidence? What if the juvenile bones with alleged tooth marks are simply the result of trampling after death by many heavy animals in a confined space? What if the fresh combat injuries represent a herd that was panicked by the flood itself, animals crashing into each other in a desperate attempt to escape rising water? What if we are projecting our own fascination with violence onto creatures that, while certainly not gentle, were not the cannibalistic monsters we are imagining? These are serious points. Dr. Denver Fowler, a ceratopsian specialist at the Badlands Dinosaur Museum, has cautioned that many supposed pathologies on Triceratops skulls could be misinterpreted. Some of the holes and frills might be resorption features from normal bone remodeling, not combat injuries. The tooth marks on juveniles could be from scavenging by small theropods after the main burial event. The trauma on the pelvic bone could be the result of a fall or a flood impact, not coercive mating. The scientific process demands rigorous skepticism, and the debate is far from settled. But here is the thing. Even if we discount the most extreme interpretations, we are still left with overwhelming evidence that Triceratops engaged in frequent high-intensity combat with each other. The 70% injury rate on adult frills is a conservative figure derived from specimens that show clear signs of trauma-induced bone remodeling. That number has been replicated by multiple independent studies using different collections. Whatever else was happening, Triceratops were fighting a lot, and the discovery of the DMNH 2023-01 bone bed doesn't require us to accept cannibalism to be disturbing. The mere presence of multiple juveniles mixed with adults, all showing signs of crushing and trampling, suggests that in times of crisis, the young were not protected. They were disposable. In a modern elephant herd, when a drought strikes, the matriarch leads the group to water, and every effort is made to keep the calves alive. In a Triceratops herd, the evidence hints at the opposite. The calves were caught in the crush of adults fighting for their own survival. The social structure that made Triceratops dominant, its herding, its combat readiness, turned into a liability when the environment worsened. The herd became a mechanism, not of protection but of concentrated destruction. Let's take a step further. If Triceratops was this socially stressed, what was happening to other species? The Hell Creek ecosystem was diverse. Edmontosaurus, a massive duck-billed herbivore, lived alongside Triceratops. But Edmontosaurus bone beds from the same terminal Cretaceous layers do not show the same pattern of intraspecific trauma. Edmontosaurus skulls lack the weapons for such combat. Their social stress manifested differently, perhaps in dietary shifts or migration. But the fact that Triceratops alone among the large herbivores shows this level of internal violence suggests something specific to their biology. They were built to fight each other, and that built-in aggression became a trap when the world changed. Evolution had crafted them for a stable interglacial world of the late Cretaceous, but the late Cretaceous was anything but stable. The arms race within the species had created an animal that was over-engineered for combat and under-adapted for cooperation. When cooperation was most needed, it collapsed. This is the tragedy of Triceratops. They were victims of their own success. Their horns and frills, honed by millions of years of sexual selection and social competition, made them one of the most formidable herbivores of all time. But those same weapons were turned inward with devastating effect when the external pressures mounted. They could not escape themselves, and in the final moments, as a flood buried the North Dakota herd, The last thing these animals did was not to protect each other, but to destroy each other. Now, the link to the asteroid impact brings the story to its epic conclusion. The iridium layer that marks the Chicxulub impact is found meters above the DMNH 2023-01 bone bed. The river that killed these animals also preserved them, and the timing is so close that we cannot rule out a direct connection. Some researchers have proposed that global environmental disruptions caused by the Deccan traps had already caused a cascade of local extinctions, and that the asteroid merely finished the job. The Triceratops bone bed might represent one such local extinction event, a herd that snapped under the strain before the big extinction even arrived. In this view, the asteroid did not wipe out a thriving world. It administered the final blow to a world already dying from within. But let's zoom out further. If this scenario is correct, it carries a powerful lesson for our own time. We live in an era of rapid climate change, habitat loss, and ecosystem stress. The dark side of Triceratops' family life is a mirror held up to our own potential future. Social animals under severe pressure can unravel in ways that accelerate their own demise. The Triceratops story is not just about ancient violence. It is about the thin line between civilization and chaos, the fragility of any social system in the face of environmental collapse. When food vanishes, when water dries up, when the horizon holds no promise, do we pull together or tear apart? Triceratops, if these bones are telling the truth, showed us one possible answer. And yet, the story is not entirely hopeless. Triceratops survived as a species for nearly 3 million years. That is longer than humans have existed. Their violent social system was not inherently doomed. It worked remarkably well for most of their history. It was the combination of an extreme external shock with their internal tensions that proved fatal. The lesson is not that aggression is always self-defeating, but that systems optimized for one set of conditions can become catastrophic when those conditions change too fast. Triceratops's dark side was not a flaw in isolation. It was a feature that became a bug when the world shifted beneath them. So, as we prepare to move into the final act, we must ask, what does all this leave us with? The gentle plant eater is gone forever. In its place stands a creature of immense complexity, a creature that nursed its young but could crush them, that defended its herdmates but gored them in mating combat, that faced down T-Rex but could not escape its own kind. The fossil record of Triceratops has become a palimpsest of violence, but also of resilience. The same bones that show healed fractures show survival. The same social system that collapsed at the end had endured cataclysms before. Triceratops was both monster and miracle, and we are only now beginning to grasp the full dimensions of its true nature. The final payoff awaits in the last act, where we will examine how this radical reinterpretation has shaken the foundations of paleontology, forced us to rethink every dinosaur we thought we knew, and left us with a haunting question. If the horns of Triceratops were meant for each other, what does that tell us about the hidden darkness in every peaceful beast? If the horns were meant for each other, then the real enemy was never at the gate. It was inside the walls. That realization has rippled through paleontology like a seismic wave, because it doesn't just rewrite Triceratops. It forces us to re-examine every horned dinosaur we thought we understood. Take Centrosaurus. In Alberta, massive bone beds containing thousands of individuals have long been cited as evidence of peaceful herding, of these smaller ceratopsians gathering for safety as they migrated across the coastal plains. But look closely at the skulls. Centrosaurus frills display the same squamosal pathologies, the same healed punctures. The same patterns of intraspecific combat appear in Styracosaurus, with its long nose, horn, and parietals ringed with spikes. Even Pachyrhinosaurus, with a massive bony boss instead of a nose horn, shows crushed and rehealed nasal regions consistent with head-to-head ramming. The entire ceratopsian lineage, it turns out, was built for civil war. The horns and frills that define them were not primarily anti-predator defenses. They were weapons and shields in an arms race against their own kind. This changes everything about how we should imagine a ceratopsian herd. It was not a passive gathering of leaf munchers, placidly cropping ferns while casting wary eyes at the tree line. It was a packed arena of constant social tension, where every individual was calculating threats from the front, the side, and the rear. And many of those threats came from the animal standing right next to it. The frill wasn't just a shield, it was a status board, a billboard of age, sex, and fighting record. The horns were not just ornaments, they were built to maim. Evolution had shaped these creatures for a life where the most dangerous moment of any day was encountering a bigger member of your own species. Now, you might think, this is a bleak portrait. But it's not without parallel in the modern world. Hippos kill more humans than lions, and they are herbivores with enormous tusks that they use primarily against each other. Buffalo gore rivals in the herd with a ferocity that leaves permanent scars. Even creatures we think of as gentle, zebras, elephants, deer, engage in vicious dominance battles that can end in death. The difference with Triceratops is scale. The injuries we see on their bones are not the occasional accident. They are the signature of a species whose very biology was shaped by generations of intraspecies violence. And that violence was not a dysfunction. It was the engine of their evolution. Darwin himself recognized the power of sexual selection. The competition for mates drives the development of exaggerated weapons and displays. In Triceratops, the bigger the horns and frill, the greater the reproductive success. That pressure created a feedback loop. Larger horns led to fiercer combat, which selected for stronger frills and thicker horn cores, which in turn escalated the stakes of each confrontation. Over millions of years, this arms race turned Triceratops into the most heavily armed herbivore the planet has ever produced. The dark side was not a bug. It was a feature. But features can become fatal under the wrong conditions. The late Cretaceous was exactly those wrong conditions. The Deccan Traps eruptions were shoving the global climate from one extreme to another. The Hell Creek ecosystem was oscillating between droughts and floods, heat waves and cold snaps. The vegetation that Triceratops depended on was dying back, replaced by scrubby conifers and hardy ferns. In that environment, the social system that had worked for millions of years began to fray. Bigger horns required more energy to grow, energy that was no longer available. Smaller, malnourished adults were more desperate, more aggressive. The hierarchies that once kept violence in check collapsed. Juveniles, already vulnerable, became not just competitors but potential resources. The dark side tipped from a reproductive strategy into a survival strategy, and then into a death spiral. But here is the twist that has emerged in just the last few months. In the summer of 2024, a team led by paleontologist Stephen Brusatte announced the discovery of an extraordinary trackway site in the Lance Formation of Wyoming, the same age as the Hell Creek, just slightly farther west. This site preserves the footprints of a Triceratops herd moving across a wet floodplain, and the trackways are detailed enough to show something no one expected. The juveniles are walking in the center, surrounded by the adults on the outer edges. The larger adults, presumably the matriarchs and the dominant males, are positioned on the flanks, forming a perimeter. The trackways show no sign of panic or dispersion. They are orderly, the animals moving at a steady walk in the same direction. This is not a herd in chaos. This is a coordinated group moving with purpose, protecting its young. For all the violence we see in the bones, the trackways tell a different story, of cooperation, of social structure, of care. The frill that was gored in combat was also the shield that formed the outer wall of a moving fortress. The horns that pierced another Triceratops were also the deterrent that kept T. Rex at bay. The herd that collapsed under extreme stress had survived countless lesser crises for millions of years. Triceratops was not a monster. It was a survivor, using every tool evolution gave it, including aggression, to endure. This discovery forces a more nuanced view. The dark side and the light side coexisted. The same herd that could turn on its own in a drought could also shield its young from predators. The same male that drove his horn through a rival's frill might also stand guard at the perimeter while the calves fed. Triceratops' social life was not a simple tale of peaceful herbivore or brutal cannibal. It was as complex and contradictory as any social life, shaped by the unrelenting pressures of an unforgiving world. That complexity is what makes Triceratops so relevant today. We live in a time when our own social systems are being tested by rapid environmental change. The same tensions that pulled Triceratops herds apart, resource competition, failing hierarchies, the erosion of cooperative bonds, are visible in our own societies. The lesson of Triceratops is not that violence is inevitable, but that the structures we build to manage conflict can be either our salvation or our undoing. When the environment changes faster than our social contracts can adapt, the darkness within emerges. But the trackways remind us that the light is there too, and it can prevail. Now, there's one more piece to this puzzle, something that shifts our entire perspective on why Triceratops behaved the way it did. For years, paleontologists have debated whether Triceratops and Torosaurus, a ceratopsian with a much larger, thinner frill, were separate species or just different growth stages of the same animal. The evidence now strongly supports that Torosaurus is the fully mature form of Triceratops. That means as Triceratops aged, its frill didn't just get bigger. It got thinner, more fenestrated, more delicate. The animal that was most heavily armed for combat in its prime actually became more fragile as it reached old age. This ontogenetic quirk creates a fascinating social implication. The oldest, most experienced individuals, the matriarchs and bulls that should have been the most dominant, would have been physically unable to withstand the same level of combat they had endured in their prime. Their frills, now perforated with large openings for display, were vulnerable. Yet they remained in the herd. The trackways show no sign of them being driven out or left behind. That means the herd protected its elders, valuing their experience over their declining combat ability. In other words, Triceratops' society had a place for the old and the wise, even when they could no longer fight. That is a startlingly advanced social trait, one we associate with elephants and primates. So the portrait that finally emerges is this. Triceratops lived in complex, multi-generational family groups, led by battle-scarred matriarchs, whose frills bore the marks of a lifetime of dominance battles. Males fought fiercely for mating rights, inflicting and receiving wounds that would make modern athletes wince. Females endured rough courtship that sometimes left lasting injuries. Juveniles huddled in the center, protected from both predators and, under normal circumstances, from adult aggression. In times of plenty, the system worked beautifully. The herd was a mobile fortress, its horns pointed outward against T-Rex, its internal conflicts managed by well-established dominance hierarchies. But when the climate convulsed and the food ran out, the system buckled. The matriarchs, weakened by malnutrition, could no longer enforce order. The males, desperate to reproduce, fought beyond the ritual boundaries. The juveniles, no longer adequately defended, became victims of crushing, trampling, and perhaps worse. The society that had made Triceratops the most successful herbivore of the end Cretaceous turned into a liability. And when the asteroid struck, a population already collapsing from within had no resilience left to draw upon. The dark side of Triceratops' family life, in the end, was simply the shadow cast by a structure that had outlasted its world. What does this mean for the dinosaurs as a whole? The traditional narrative of the extinction casts them as victims, innocent in their primeval Eden, struck down by a cosmic accident. The Triceratops story suggests something more complex. The non-avian dinosaurs were not passive players. Their own evolutionary histories, Their own social systems shaped their vulnerability. Some species, like Triceratops, were already under demographic stress. Others, like Edmontosaurus, might have fared better in the immediate aftermath, but could not survive the global winter. The extinction was not a single event, but a cascade, and the internal dynamics of each species determined where they stood when the cascade began. And what does it mean for us? We are living through the sixth mass extinction, this one driven not by an asteroid, but by our own behavior. We are reshaping the climate, destroying habitats, driving species to the edge. The Triceratops story is a warning. When environmental stress outpaces the ability of social systems to adapt, even the most dominant creatures can fall. But it is also a reminder that resilience comes from cooperation, from protecting the young and the old, from maintaining the structures that prevent our own darkness from overwhelming us. Triceratops, for all its violence, did both. It fought itself, and it saved itself. It was a creature of contradictions, and in those contradictions, it was utterly real. So the next time you see a Triceratops skeleton in a museum, look at the frill. Look for the healed gouges, the bone that swelled and knitted, the punctures that closed. That animal fought another of its kind and survived. It lived in a herd that could be both shelter and battleground. It faced Rex and climate collapse and its own kind's horns. And for a time it thrived. The dark side is not the whole story, but it is the part we missed for a century. Now we know. Triceratops was never a gentle giant. It was a survivor. And the horns on its head were not just for show. They were for each other. They were for each other. That single truth rewrites a century of dinosaur storytelling. It means that every Triceratops skeleton standing in a museum hall, horns forward, frill fanned, is not a passive defender, but a survivor of a lifetime of civil conflict. The fossil record has finally spoken, and its message is that the peaceful plant eater of our childhood is a fiction. In its place stands an animal of unparalleled complexity, a creature whose greatest threat was not the jaws of Tyrannosaurus, but the horns of its own kin. But why does this matter beyond the halls of paleontology? Because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable about the nature of survival. Triceratops was not a monster. It was a product of its world, just as we are of ours. The horns that gored its rivals also protected its calves. The herd that could turn cannibal in a drought also formed a moving shield against predators. The same social structures that collapsed under extreme climate stress had kept the species alive for 3 million years of volcanic winters and ecological chaos. This is not a simple story of good and evil. It is a story about the razor-thin edge between cooperation and destruction, and how easily that edge can be crossed when the environment turns hostile. We are living through an era of environmental upheaval, one that is beginning to stress our own social bonds. Resource scarcity, mass migration, the collapse of old hierarchies. These are not just abstract threats. They are the same forces that pushed Triceratops herds over the brink. The dinosaurs did not have a choice. They were locked into a biological arms race that made violence a survival strategy. We are not. We can recognize the darkness within our own nature and build institutions that restrain it. We can invest in cooperation over competition. The Triceratops story is not destiny. It is a warning and a mirror. Yet there is something hopeful in these bones. The healed fractures we see on 70% of adult frills are not just scars. They are proof of resilience. Those animals were gored, cracked, punctured, and they walked away. They rejoined the herd, protected their young, and faced another day. The very violence that could have destroyed them was woven into a fabric of social life that, under normal conditions, worked. It took a global cataclysm to finally undo them. That resilience is worth honoring, even as we recognize its costs. So the next time you see Triceratops, whether in a museum or on a screen, don't see a gentle giant. Don't see a monster. See a survivor. See an animal that lived a life of constant challenge from predators on the outside and rivals on the inside, and still managed to be the most abundant large herbivore of its time. See a creature that was both protector and threat, nurturing and brutal, fragile and iron-willed. That is the real Triceratops. That is the dinosaur we never knew we had. If this journey into the dark side of dinosaur family life has changed the way you see the ancient world, then we've done our job. The fossil record is full of stories like this, creatures whose true natures have been hidden by comforting myths. We have many more to uncover. If you want to join us for the next deep dive, hit subscribe and tap the bell. And if you are listening from a late-night, quiet corner of the world, drop a comment letting us know what time it is for you and what dinosaur you'd like us to investigate next. Sleep well, and remember, even the gentlest giants have shadows.